Today we're going to discuss this idea of paying attention. I started the post that I wrote with an old story. It's an old Zen story about a student who was looking for a meditation teacher and had heard about one. And he came through his travels over the hills and the dales and through the valleys and kept asking from village to village for this meditation master who he had heard about. And sure enough, at some point came down upon this valley, and there was this teacher seated in front of a tree or beneath a tree, and a gathering of people around him, all deeply in meditation. It was all silent, bucolic, quite beautiful, wonderful. And the seeker came and got close enough that he could be present without interrupting anyone, and felt really compelled to introduce himself to the teacher, but didn't want to interrupt. And so instead sat at a distance away. And while everyone else was in a state of repose and meditation, he was sitting there with his mind in turmoil. What should I do? Will I get accepted? Did I come to the right place? What should I say? I know he knows I'm here. He's a meditation teacher. I know he can imagine that I've come, and yet I don't know if I should interrupt him. Should I call him sir? Should I have brought a gift? Oh my goodness, do I look fat in my robes? He was just sitting there going on and on in his head the way we do, uncomfortable and unclear about what he was supposed to do. And at some point he was interrupted when the meditation master, from still quite a ways away, said, "Hello!" And he kind of woke up out of his reverie and he said, "Yes?" And the meditation master said, "What can I do for you?" And he sat there and got even more frightened and more concerned, and his mind went in more directions. And the meditation master sensed this and walked over to him and sat down beside him and said, "It's okay. Thank you for coming. What is it that you need?" And the young gentleman said, I want to learn how to meditate. And the meditation master said, "Okay." And he said, "Will you teach me?" And the meditation master said, "Okay, let's do it right now." And the young man got all nervous then, and he was like, "Well, okay, then let's do it right now." And the meditation master said, "Okay, sit up straight." And the young man did so, and he sat in a pretty good posture. And then the meditation master simply said, "Okay, pay attention." And the young man said, "Yes, sir." And and then immediately started going, should I have said sir? Should I have called him Rinpoche? Should I have called him something else? Should I even be talking to him? What does he think of me? And I know I'm imposing on him. And his mind just went around and around and around. And at some point, the meditation master was looking at him when he came out of his reverie, and he was still waiting for the meditation master to speak. And so he said to him, "Yes, sir, tell me how to meditate." And the meditation master said, "Okay, pay attention." And he said, "Yes, sir." And he snapped to, and he was paying attention. And he waited and waited, and then started worrying again and wondering again. And he said, "Okay, sir, I'm paying attention." And the meditation master just smiled and said, "Pay attention." And the technique of learning how to meditate is learning how to pay attention, how to go beyond the cacophony of our own mind, our own self-doubt, our own need to worry about who we are and how we place and how we fit in the various hierarchies that we suppose are existing, that we kind of create in our own mind, these fabrications and where we fit in this world. Meditation is about cutting through all of that to just what is here. And the method that we use is just to come back to the present. Because what's in the present is none of those things. None of those things we're worrying about, none of the things we're speculating on. The meditation master looked at him again and smiled and said, pay attention. As the story goes, 15 years later, they were still having this conversation. The kid would go, well, again, what are we supposed to learn now? And the meditation master would say, pay attention. Because until he could learn how to pay attention, then we can't really learn anything in our lives. And it's very interesting because all the things we learn jobs, we learn skills, we learn trades, we learn how to accomplish tasks, we learn languages, we learn philosophies, we learn how to interact with people, we learn endless reams of information about our own psychology, but we never ever look at the very tool that does the learning, the very tool that ascertains everything in our life, everything we see, hear, feel, and touch, every thought we have, all of the six senses, all are generated by this mind. And our culture doesn't look inward. It's as though we have a firewall that keeps us from being able to actually see the actual inner working of the system. And I think that we are very romantic about those things. So we must think, wow, it must be a big, dark, frightening place. But it's actually a place that's filled with space, much more space than we actually understand, much more space than we really realize. The space of the mind is endless. It's incomprehensible how endless it is because it goes beyond the constraints of what we feel like we can comprehend, which is all the things we feel we can control. But our minds are actually much, much bigger than that, just as the universe is much bigger than that. So our thinking mind and our, let's say, ego-oriented mind, the mind that identifies with the thinking that it does, is like a very small subset. It's like a little kind of small room in this very large, large space. And in that room, we're constantly going over and over the same ground we've gone over and over many, many times before. Performing, as the old story says, the same experiment again and again, expecting different results. We're constantly reiterating the same information. When meditation teachers say stop thinking or come back to the present, or they talk about things like non-thought, the idea isn't that thoughts don't exist. It just means they don't have the weight that we place upon them when you see them into context of the larger picture. They're just blips on the screen, and they're basically like TV commercials. I'm getting to be venerable in my aging process. And so I've seen a fair bit of television in my time, and people can talk about all they want, particularly younger generation people that feel like their generation is always the only generation and everything that came before was, dinosaurs and rocks and such. And the fact is, I've been seeing the same sitcoms again and again, the same stories again and again. The CGI, the graphics, the actual production of the commercials is better and of the movies is better. That's all developed, but it's the same old horse meat that we've constantly been feeding ourselves again and again and again. And I'm not saying there's not occasionally something different, or there's not occasionally something very cool, or it's not occasionally fun to just watch the same old stuff again and again. But it's a mistake to believe that our normal thinking, our discursive thinking, is anything but that. It's like echoes of the endless things we've constantly gone over and over and over again in our brain, with occasionally a fresh insight coming in. That fresh insight gives us a little room. And so then our little room incrementally, maybe over time, becomes a little bit bigger because we've noticed a few things. We start to understand gender politics. We start to understand what racism actually is. We start to understand what economic inequality actually is. Perhaps these things help us broaden our scope and we begin to see a larger picture. But we're still in a small room compared to the possibility of the space that we. Consistent, regular meditation practice, particularly a meditation practice that makes no sense. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Actually disabuses this idea that we are what we think. I think, therefore I am. Well, Descartes, that's you. I would say I would add a couple of syllables to that maxim and say, Renee, you think, therefore you are thinking. And that's really all that establishes that your mind thinks. But the fact that we see, we know, we feel, and we deeply understand is, I believe, what makes us human. That we care, that our heart could open and that we could touch each other. That's what makes us human. Not these thoughts that are sometimes the same reiterative thoughts again and again. In some meditation traditions, particularly the Zen tradition from which our story came, they don't like to talk at all. They just yell at you if you ask too many questions, you know. So there's great dialogues that used to happen up at Zen Mountain Monastery with John Daido Roshi and his students. I went to one of his lectures. It wasn't this extreme, but they published the Men Zen Mountain record, and that would come out monthly or something, and there would be transcripts of his talks. It would be funny. There would be a very intelligent question. Sir, what is the nature of reality and how is it reflected by my own thinking? And the answer would be, all of these like consonants and vowels and exclamation points. It was clear that Daido Roshi, who some people thought was a truly, truly awake individual, just would scream at these people. And Trungpa Rinpoche came from a tradition where they had a little more intellectual discourse. He was trained very heavily in a lot of different methodologies, and not the least of which was a stint with Oxford University. So he really understood philosophy and psychology and how to talk to people and had a real value for that. But he also tried to point out the fact that we are not all the things we think, because if we are, then we're just limiting ourselves in this very small way. So his students would, who were very, very intelligent, he had a way of attracting the smartest and brightest people that were interested in meditation at the time. They typically went to colleges out east, like at Brandeis, and were professors or students, really quite brilliant people who became brilliant teachers themselves. But during the early days, they would ask these long, convoluted questions, you know, like trying to show everyone in the room how intelligent they were and show themselves how intelligent they were. And Trungpa would actually listen very, very patiently, and he would smile and stare at them, and there would be this incredibly long talk. And then one of his classic responses would be, "I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?" And invariably, or I would say the majority of the time, maybe not invariably, but the majority of the time, the person would go back in and repeat the question. There's one talk, it's online, you could see it. I don't remember which the title was, what he's actually teaching, where this happened 3 times. "I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?" The person was so nervous, "Yes, sir," and then launched into another long thing. And you see what Trump Rinpoche was trying to explain, and what I'm trying to very clumsily here convey, is that the thoughts, the logic that we have, we get very attached to, but it's not really sometimes anything other than us telling ourselves that we're still here. Like we're making ourselves feel comfortable or feel angry or feel upset. And what Trump was trying to do is show people this bigger space around that there's this larger space around our thoughts. Now, that doesn't mean all our thoughts are wrong or that there's anything wrong with thinking. Not at all. It just means the people that are really brilliant in the world, the people that really make differences, make kind of paradigmatic leaps of logic and thought and technology in the mind, are able to think outside the box because they see that larger picture. There's a play, one of my favorite theater plays, but there's a line where there's a philosophy teacher and he is trying to explain to his working class family who don't understand what the heck it is he does. And he's trying to explain to them and he gets frustrated and a little upset at them all. And he said, I operate on things, I see things, you're in things, you operate in things, so you don't see them. I don't know if that conveys anything. It's a beautiful line in a very powerful play. But what he's illustrating here is that there is the possibility that we actually can see a larger picture. So we maybe look at someone across the room and go, I don't like that person, but we don't actually see that. What we see is that they're irritating or they're bothering us or they talk too much or we don't like the sound of their voice. And we don't actually look at the very thing that is actually creating the picture, right? Jane actually, I think it was last week, said that, or maybe it was in the context of our other study situation, but you talked a little bit about the first step. I think it was in the study group last week on Saturday that you said the first step is you look at yourself and you go, what's going on here? Did I get enough sleep? You know, I could always look and say, am I over caffeinated? Because that will always lead me to believe my brain very easily, right? As soon as I'm upset at someone else, one way to see the bigger picture is not to argue with that. Maybe you're right. Maybe they are a jerk, or maybe that is a situation. But how can we zoom out, as Reggie Watts would say, the comedian or the humorist Reggie Watts would say, zoom out. When in doubt, zoom out and get a bigger picture. Take the 30,000-foot view, as people say, and just look at the bigger picture here. Oh, and it always includes our own culpability. It's got to, right? Unless we're completely enlightened. And if we were, then we wouldn't have gotten upset probably in the first place. We would be handling things with a big equanimity. If we get upset, it's usually because we have some ego investment involved. And if we have some ego investment involved, it means we're part of the problem. So if I'm upset, I could look at myself and go, well, what is it that's bothering me? And it may not be lack of sleep or too much caffeine. It may well be that I find the other person frightening, or I'm unsettled, or I'm unclear about something. Okay. But that gets me a little closer to the truth than this person is a jerk. Does that make sense? It gets me a little closer to understanding how maybe I can approach the situation in a way that makes sense. If somebody is cruel to me, I could maybe step back from that and go, what's going on in their head? You know, when that's happened to me quite often. I was moving from one location to another, and my cat disappeared while I was moving, and I was very attached to the cat. And I also was not a meditator at this time, and I was a big drinker and a very aggressive little boy. man. And my neighbor, I knocked on their door and said, "Where's my cat?" And did you see my cat? And the neighbor just looked at me and said, "Your cat brings cockroaches into the house. I hope your cat is dead." And he screamed at me like that and slammed the door in me. And I lost it and banged on the door and told him what for, and said if I didn't find the cat, I was going to come in there and blah, blah, blah. I don't know what I did. I threatened him in some, early 20 something college student drunken way, banging on his door, being a kind of beast of a human, and stomped back into my house. And of course, what did I see? Somebody, Jane, please tell us. There was
The
my
cat.
cat sitting right there on the couch, like, "Hi," you know.
What's up?
So I actually went to my neighbor and I bought a bottle of brandy for him. And I went and knocked on his door, and he answered, and he was still furious. And I handed him the brandy and I said, "I'm so sorry. My cat was in here and we're leaving, and I'm taking the cat with me, and won't be a problem anymore." And I gave him the brandy and he looked at me and said, "I'm an alcoholic." And he slammed the door. So here's an example of me getting all in my head and taking it completely personally because I was freaked out about my cat. I loved that cat, you know, and I felt responsible for her and should have known. She was smarter than I was. She wasn't going anywhere. She was hiding until I got out. And then I was trying to make it better by not actually paying attention to the other person. You see what I mean? I wasn't doing anything but playing all these games because I was believing my brain. Now, I wish I could tell you this is an isolated story, but these kinds of stories, and maybe with less degrees of aggression and angst, and particularly when I started meditating, they mellowed, but I still continually believed my mind and got stuck in these scenarios that were completely combative and didn't need to be so. I could just simply step back. And as Zigar Control Rinpoche told me, and I've relayed this story before, when I kept telling him I had all these resistances to meditation practice, and he said, "Just stop struggling." And I asked him again, just like Trumpa students would ask, "Yes, but what do you mean stop struggling? Do you mean should I not practice, or should I practice?" Or I was even thinking of getting drunk before I practiced just to see if it relaxed me and all of this stuff, right? And he just looked at me again and said, "Just stop struggling." And I tried it one more time, and finally he looked at me, and the whole room actually in unison said, "Stop struggling." Because I was the only one that didn't see that I was in there punching my way through a paper bag of my own projections, that none of it was real, that all I had to do was relax and encourage myself to practice, like just relax into the momentum of it rather than force myself into it. And if I couldn't do that, yeah, then I could relax and not practice. Stop struggling. Learn to see the bigger view. Learn to see the larger picture by just stepping back and allowing a little space. And that space happens with meditation practice. And all we have to do, and this is where I'll end this talk today, is to just be very naive about our instructions. Just follow the instructions, come back to the breath. And the big thinking mind goes, "Yeah, well, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that I'm regarding my thoughts or I'm not regarding my thoughts?" Just come back to the breath. "Yeah, but if I do that, will I blah, 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 blah." Listen, just come back to the breath. And it's that razor of coming back to the simplicity of the present moment, like Occam's razor, cutting back to the simplest proposition. The simplest proposition is just now. What's here right now? And what begins to happen is we're retraining the mind to stop running off into all these theories and to learn how to just pay attention by catching our thoughts and coming back to the breath again and again and again. And if it feels fruitless, so much the better. If it feels senseless, so much the better. And if it's boring, so much the better. Because all of those things, fruitfulness, excitement, are all ego ways to not pay attention. Because most of the time, if we're going to pay attention, our world is very flat and very ordinary and just what it is right here. And if we want to be meditators with a stable meditation practice, our work is to develop our resiliency to be able to be there with that ordinary, boring breath after the next breath. That's what gives us this profound sense of space that allows the mind to operate more effectively and efficiently. It's not thinking out of panic, trying to figure things out. It's working from the base of serenity and that ordinary space of openness that meditation begins to cultivate within us. And then we just see. We see what we need to do next. It all becomes a little more clear. And I could say, in my personal experience, that happens. Not that I'm particularly clear, and I still fall back, and I still am always toggling between the mind of clarity and the mind of confusion, but seeing that is everything. And that allows us to traverse this path of meditation, to be able to see where it is we're going, because we're settling down the mind and we're learning to pay attention, just paying attention. So during the meditation, I drew a parallel between paying attention or mindfulness and loving kindness or compassion. It's something I heard Shastri, or was once Shastri, no longer Shastri, but Ethan Nichtern, the teacher, talked about that mindfulness or coming back to the breath is an expression of loving kindness. It's actually feeling this loving connection to the present. And we could actually, whether that's true or not, it's a kind of a nice little way to kind of encourage ourselves to do it. Not to say, oh, I have to pay attention, sit up straight and pay attention, young man. But more like, it's okay, just relax, give up the struggle, and just be here. Just be here. And let the mind do what it does best, which is just see what's going on.